Case study for EDL 851, a good teacher turns bad. Stresses at home creates a problem at school is the title. Ooh. So first of all, the summary is Mrs. Horton is a first grade teacher. She has an impeccable track record. She's a past Teacher of the Year recipient and always worked hard to meet her students' needs. Recently, however, she is going through some trauma at home and is having some difficulty at school. These things are following her, and her school environment or her classroom environment is kind of hurting because of this. Mrs. Wilson is the principal at the school, and she's new, and she's trying to see past some of the problems that Mrs. Horton is showing, and I'm hoping to be able to work through them with her. However, the problems don't seem to be getting better, and it's affecting her students, her parents, the faculty within the school as well. And there's now been a big problem with a parent that had come in, and Mrs. Horton has lost her temper with him. So problem identification. What I know about Mrs. Horton is she was once the Teacher of the Year. She's stressed due to some personal items that's going on at home, and that is flowing into the classroom. She's no longer involved. She used to come in over the summer and make sure that she was prepared for the students. She would spend time after hours, just making sure that she was prepared and had a good relationship with the students, and that just isn't happening anymore. Parents are unhappy. This is the first week or a month and a half of school, and there's already quite a few parent complaints. The students are unhappy. She's becoming non-compliant at school. So there's a reading curriculum that they're piloting, and she's refusing to do it or not wanting to do it. She's refusing to do parent-teacher conferences, and she's also not communicating adequately with the parents. So it's causing a pretty good problem there. Mrs. Wilson is a new principal, and she doesn't really want to rock the boat. She had mentioned that there wasn't a whole lot to change, and so she kind of stepped in, and things flowed as they did before she became the principal. She was aware of Miss Horton's problems, and she's trying to work them through and trying to be understanding of the stress that Mrs. Horton is going through, and hoping that she can get through it. She has gotten many letters and calls regarding Mrs. Horton, and she did set up a parent meeting with one of Mrs. Horton's parents, Mr. Stafford. And when they went to show up to the meeting, Mrs. Horton was not prepared. She was scrambling to try to find the documentation, and then soon got out of hand and yelled at the parent. And Mrs. Horton then at that point requested to meet at another time, which was, she acted quite well in that moment. And then there's some, on Mrs. Wilson's part, to me, there was some reluctant to understand the problem, reluctance to working with Mrs. Horton. She was hoping the problem would just go away. What I need to know how many parents have contacted Ms. Horton about meeting with her that she has blown off. I need to know what the coworkers see happening every day, because maybe the parents are overreacting. So get a feel for what's actually happening within that classroom, particularly when me as the principal was not around. I would want to look at Mrs. Horton's academic data. Are the students learning, or are they not learning? That would indicate a lot of things within the classroom as well. Has Mrs. Wilson asked the students how they feel about their class? Has Mrs. Horton asked, how do the students actually feel? And now, granted, they're first graders, but trying to get an idea of how they're feeling about that class. I would also need to know if Mrs. Wilson is willing to acknowledge what's happening in the classroom, and if she's willing to strive to fix it. I also would need to know what support can be given to Mrs. Horton to help her stress or depression and everything that's going on in Ms. Horton's life. What is available within the district or even outside of the district that can can help her be able to work through what she's going through. So what's the problem? Problem identification would be Mrs. Horton is going through some personal trauma. It's affecting her work efficacy. The reports that students are unhappy in her classroom and parents are unhappy to have her as a teacher. Mrs. Wilson seems to not have taken action effectively and promptly to give support to Mrs. Horton when she needed it. She also didn't seem to have built great relationships within the school. So with Mrs. Horton or other staff. And then also Mr. Stafford would like to move his child from Mrs. Horton's room. What strategies or what's the plan of action? Well, the first thing I would do is seek advice from a mentor principal or the superintendent, as well as inform them, particularly the superintendent, about what's going on, what the situation is with Mrs. Horton and that parent and other parents possibly. I would want to have a one-on-one conversation with Ms. Horton, not necessarily about what happened in that, but try to desperately build a relationship. Ask what's happening. Ask how you can support what she's going through at home. Empathize with Miss Horton and try to get to the bottom of why Mrs. Horton, why her teaching and why her ability within the classroom has taken, it seems like, a 180. Show that you are there for her. Show that you're there to support her and give her what she needs in order to be successful, but also that she needs to have some accountability within the classroom. So at that point, then discuss what happened with Mr. Stafford and collaborate with Ms. Horton about what the next steps might be. Obviously, I have some steps in mind. One being an apology needs to happen. Another meeting needs to happen, and we need to get down to the bottom of what's going on. But getting Mrs. Horton's input, having a plan of action with her and her involved in that is a really important step in getting this issue solved. Discuss all of the accusations that are swirling around in the community about Miss Horton. Talk to her about that and about the negativity in her room. And at that point, then seek a plan while collaborating with Miss Horton. Ask her what a plan might be in order to squelch that negativity and turn that around to have positive connections and positive feedback for the students, the parents, and the faculty. Next, I would learn about Miss Horton's feelings regarding the conferences in the reading program. She's showing some non-compliance there. So ask her what it is about it that she doesn't want to do. Get to the bottom of why she's acting the way she's acting towards these two things. Obviously, I wouldn't think conferences in the past were an option. They're not an option. So you have to set that precedence of, you can't really refuse to do parent-teacher conferences. So getting to understand why that is, and then try to solve that and try to come to an understanding about that. As far as a reading program, give support for implementing this reading program. What support does she need? Perhaps there's a reading specialist, perhaps there's an instructional coach that can be there to help implement this reading program within her classroom. I would also urge her to talk to her students and ask them how they feel about the class. Start to build those relationships with the students so they are comfortable, they are excited to go to school and not upset and sad and crying as what the feedback is coming back at. Get feedback from coworkers, not in a gossipy, terrible type of way, but more asking how I could support. What do they hear about what's going on? Is there something that I need, that I could know, that I can help Mrs. Horton and her being successful in helping the students learn and feel safe within the school and the classroom. I would also ask Ms. Horton if she needs to take some days off, get some counseling, get counseling services through the district. I know our district has counseling services. So ask her if that is a possibility, then that might help her be able to get things turned around and begin to heal on her part so that it doesn't come within that classroom. And finally, I would meet or call Mr. Stafford and explain the steps. Be very transparent with him. Explain what I had established with Mrs. Horton, the steps that are taken to improve Mrs. Horton's class. And at that point, I would ask for time to show that improvement within the class and keep his student within Mrs. Horton's class, and do everything I could to prevent that from happening, from moving that student. As far as resolving the issues based on the prompting success of all students, the number one thing I would say would be relationships need to be built. They need to be built, administration to teachers, administration to the community, to parents, to students, also teacher to teacher, teacher to student, teacher to the parents, the community. So really build up relationships, and that important piece of school is relationships, because once those relationships are established, then it comes to trust, and you're building that trust among everyone, and that sets a school culture that everyone is there to support one another, and everyone has high expectations, and we can meet those high expectations only because we are there to support one another. That's the only way that you can survive, not survive, but that's the only way that you can be able to be successful in school. Teaching is hard. Teaching is very hard. And so in order to do the best that you can do and promote the success of all students, we have to be there to be able to support one another, and help the students and teachers to learn to reflect on what's happening with them, and to forgive one another, and be there again to support and trust each other. What was I thinking during this time? Well, the first thing was that relatable situation. I've gone through trauma. I've gone through things personally that make it hard to make it to where it's not coming into the classroom. I've witnessed coworkers going through different things in their personal life that make it really hard not to bring that into the classroom. So that piece is a very relatable thing, because everybody has things that goes on in their life, and some harder than others. And how can we be there to support one another so that their classroom can be successful for those students? I wondered how Mrs. Wilson could have prevented what happened. How did it get to that point? Ignoring the issue is really not going to make it go away or make it get better. So getting in front of that, talking and working with Mrs. Horton and being there, I kind of reflected and felt that could have been solved, that could have been prevented if that were to happen. I also thought about, if that were my child in her classroom, how would I feel? Would I push the issue to have that child moved? Maybe. So I have to be able, as I'm the leader of a school, or as I become a principal, I have to always remember and put myself in those parents' shoes, because those are their kids and their precious children. I also thought about, how can things change if relationships haven't been built? So if a relationship hasn't been built already with Mrs. Horton and Mrs. Wilson, will Mrs. Horton be accepting of Mrs. Wilson? Mrs. Horton didn't build a relationship with Mr. Stafford, so how is that going to go? What's going to be happening, because those relationships weren't built to begin with, and it's hard to build them after something like this might have happened. I also thought about the student, and I thought, are those students learning? And my heart broke for them if they're scared to go to school, or they're not loving to go to school, and their emotions. I thought, oh, what a shame that is for those students to have to go through that environment. So the issues that might be unresolved, what if, that led right into, well, what if Miss Horton isn't compliant? What if that relationship isn't built and she says she just meets that with frustration and denial and anger? What would happen at that point? What would happen if Mr. Stafford wouldn't let down with moving his child? He says, no, I want to move my child. That display with Mrs. Horton wasn't great. I'm not going to allow her to stay in that class. And then also, once a reputation has been tarnished, it's hard to get that back. So will Mrs. Horton be able to turn it around and be able to get that reputation of teacher of the year, an outstanding teacher? Will she be able to regain that after she has obviously lost that? With reflection on standard 2, provide evidence as a leader that I'm promoting that academic success and personal well-being of the students. The first thing would be that we want to keep best teachers and keep as best teachers as we can as possible for all students. And if I were to not support that teacher and let that teacher go because she was having a rough time at home and get a new teacher in there midway through the year, that doesn't seem like it would be the best for the students either. So kind of toppling their classroom by throwing in a new teacher would really disrupt their learning. That teacher wouldn't know those students. She wouldn't know where Mrs. Horton would have left off, and it really would have been disrupting. So that Mrs. Horton is a good teacher. We know that. So giving her the support that she needs is really the best for all students. Providing Mrs. Horton and other teachers that feedback, professional development opportunities, being able to build relationships and trust with the teachers and the students and parents, and giving them support so that the teachers know that I'm there as an administrator to support them regardless of what's happening to them at home life that might be coming in to school. If I go in and I just say, oh, you're not doing well, you're out of here, what message does that give to those other teachers that I'm just going to get rid of somebody and not be there to support them and give them what they need in order to be successful? And then also holding them accountable no matter what they do, no matter what they're going through. Life lesson, as an elementary teacher, we try to teach this to our students. You're still held accountable for what needs to be done. And high expectation in teaching, building those relationships with parents and students and getting back to parents, all of those things, that is the expectation, and we have to hold those teachers accountable, but at the same time support them. And then take action if needed. So if Mrs. Horton isn't compliant, then at that point we would have to take action, put on some kind of a plan, do some goal setting in the hope that we can win back the old Mrs. Horton, and which is obviously the best for the students. And that's everything I have on my slide. I have enjoyed this class and really learned quite a bit during this class. And I thank you, and possibly take another class from you at another time.